What is conscious? What is unconscious? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is conscious? What is unconscious? The standard definition for being conscious is being aware of oneself, one's environment. That's basically it. And being unconscious would be the absence of that. So, philosophically, let's begin with just being conscious of one's environment and the things in the environment. And what does that entail? So, on the basic level, we're just talking about like knowing that you're in a world, that you're in an environment, and that there are objects in that environment. So, essentially, just understanding that you're in 3D time space in a grid coordinate, and there are objects also affixed to the grid. Now, becoming aware of oneself, which is definitely one of the fundamental drivers of philosophy, and of course of spiritual practice and other things in general, and is famously the subject of Rene Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," postulate, is a whole path, becoming aware of oneself. So, on the basic sense, one becomes aware or conscious of oneself simply by looking at yourself with the basics, with the biological basics, the 3D matter basics. You gotta have a body. Okay, cool. I wear clothes. I have effects. If you weren't satisfied that your body that you're in was enough to know that you existed, then you could still measure it by the fact that your body has effects in the 3D physical reality, and that you're using the cause and effect chain to also give you feedback that your body does in fact exist. So if there were any doubts in your mind that you were moving your own physical body, that should satiate them. You go around and you touch things, you taste things, you hear things, you push things, you drop a rock, you throw a rock through something, you touch a piece of water, you touch some water and watch it ripple, cause and effect, and then you're satisfied that, okay, I'm in a body, this is my body, I'm aware of it. And then if we want philosophically to go deeper in, to go, okay, well, fine, that's a body, but what's the inside? Am I aware of what my internals are, my essence? Essentially, we're just trying to get down to like, oh, am I aware that I have a soul? Am I aware that I have a soul and that I'm inside this body and I am using my will and exerting my free will to move the body in the way I want to? And then that will hopefully lead the individual back to knowledge of self, to knowing that it's me, my soul on the inside of this body, animating these causes and effects. Now, in order to become conscious of that, so we have the consciousness, became conscious of the body, and there's scientific means to do that through the cause and effect, and then the same thing can be done for the internal, for the inner, for the soul, and we can start to get into a realm where we start to, I think the best way, and of course it's philosophy, so it's up for debate or up for further discussion, but I think the best way is to measure it by intent. If we want to find out the inner self, then we want to, usually the most impersonal, most universal way to determine that is to do things that can be measured through cause and effect. And when it comes to matters of the inner soul or the inner life, and in this case, we're attempting to do things with the idea of trying to prove to ourselves that we're aware of ourselves and are conscious, then I think that beginning with intent is one of the best ways forward. So internally, in the inner life, in my mind, in my inner self, I come up with an intent. And whatever I choose for that, then I express that. I express that intent. I use my body to express that intent. But already in that process of going inward, I've already, to myself, become conscious of the fact and aware of the fact that my inner process differs from my biological outer process. Because my biological outer process is stationary, while my inner life is moving rapidly. I'm cycling through thoughts, I'm cycling through feelings, I'm projecting potential cause and effect scenarios from my inner space. However, my body can remain completely motionless aside for autonomic functions. So at that point, I've already achieved another level of awareness, another level of consciousness of self. Because in this stream, we've already established the biological, physical awareness of self and proven to ourselves that that exists. And now, simply by engaging in an internal process, which we can verify internally has energy and momentum and thought generating internally, while our physical body is remaining, in contrast, stationary. Now we know that there is an inner life, that there is an internal life. And we can even do really basic things. In our inner life, we can just say, okay, if this is my body, I would like to move my right hand. And then you raise your right hand. I did that. It was my intention to raise my right hand, and I did. Now it's my intention to put it back down. It's my intention to close my eyes. I did it. Now it's my intention to open my eyes. I did it. Okay. Well, the body didn't do that. Whatever's inside this guy did that. And not only did whatever's inside this guy do that, whatever's inside this guy who came up with the intention to make the guy inside this guy do the thing with his body did that. And we continue to do that. And we can get more complicated and we can get more sophisticated and we can get deeper with this sort of intention exercise. And we can do it ad nauseum until at some point we show to ourselves that we are in fact the essence of ourselves and that we are consciously intending to use the fusion, the buffer between the interaction between our inner self and our outer self in concert to create actions that originate with the inner intent. And we can do iterations of that until we are satisfied that it is in fact us inside of ourselves who is doing that. And we will receive feedback depending on the nature of the intention that we decide to pursue in this experiment of self-awareness, of consciousness, of becoming conscious. We can send the intentions out in various means. They can be very gross, very obvious, gross mechanical exercises to do this, like raising hands or moving body parts or doing all sorts of things, whatever we come up with. Or they can be extremely refined and extremely intent based on a much more energetic inner level, using our body to send out inner intentions, and with the intention of receiving feedback or being aware of the feedback that's going to come back. It can be things on the inner refined level. We can decide that we're going to send emotional messages out from our physical body to other people with the intention of seeing what comes back. And if we do that scientifically enough with enough people, we can get correlating data to say, okay, what if I send out messages of love to people? will they receive those messages of love and return them in a degree, not necessarily that they're returning it in a specified manner, but in a way that acknowledges that the intention of that outward communication that originated in the inner realm was of love. And we do that with enough people where we get feedback and can scientifically deduce that there's a high correlation between what the inner intention was and what not only what the external world's response was, but what other people who presumably, but not necessary to our experiment, are also receiving an inner life, are communicating back to us. And if we do that with enough iterations, we can logically arrive at a point which validates our inner existence, especially when combined with intent being part of it, because the intent deductively can only come from the inner life. Intent cannot be born out of like the physical biology alone, the external life alone. There needs to be an inner animus to express that intent. And when we do that to a sufficient enough iterations, then we can say, oh, well, now I'm conscious. Because in that, as the intentions come back, then we can get more into the Descartes area where we start going, well, you know, what's at the core of this focus of the inner experience? And we can say thought or mind, however you want to say it. The soul is the energy beneath those processes, but within the inner process, we can say that thought is sort of the focusing mechanism. And when we say thought and focus in this inner area, we can start to really describe that as becoming conscious. And then when it expands, we can start to say that that's becoming our consciousness. Like when we're really down the road of being conscious, then we can really start to say, okay, that's consciousness. And on the flip side, what is unconscious in this experience? Like let's say that we've already satisfied to ourselves, and becoming conscious is a thing that can really only be satisfied by self. It's something that you have to do for yourself. You have to be satisfied that you are the experiencer of your inner self, and that you are the one who is generating the intent, that you are the one who is doing the focus, you are the one who's becoming conscious, you are the one who's becoming your own consciousness. And all of these philosophical discussions, they can never prove it to you. They can only be descriptions of people within their own inner experiences, relaying to you inner experiences and guidelines that worked for them. Because as you become conscious and self-conscious or self-aware and grow into consciousness, it is a self-validating cycle as you go through it. And that is the process of activating your free will, which we'll get to in another video. But become validating your own consciousness to yourself by first becoming conscious, then validating your consciousness as you become self-aware. That will prepare you for the activation of free will and logging into and being compatible with other consciousnesses of innumerable variety. And on the flip side, there is unconscious. And the unconscious is before we engage in becoming conscious and aware, or even as we are, that's the whole set of other things that we have not brought into the focus of the light of our attention. And arguably anything that we're experiencing before we become conscious can be deemed in the unconscious. So, and even if we're fully aware and we're enlightened and free-willed and have our consciousness, going at full tilt, there's still going to be things that are in the unconscious because they're simply just not in our field of attention. Now, back in the beginning, when you're not at that high level, things that are in the unconscious include ourselves. Until we become conscious of ourselves, we are essentially running unconscious programming. And we can say philosophically that like it's, we've inherited DNA routines, and so our hereditary inheritance is essentially running our biological show until our inner self gets up to speed with consciousness and awareness. So essentially everything's an unconscious routine until you become conscious of it. And for some people, some philosophers will say that man, until he becomes conscious, will live his life and call the unconscious unfoldings in his life fate. And there's definitely truth to that. But as one becomes aware of bringing things out of unconsciousness into consciousness, which many people call that alchemy, you can call it whatever you want. Some people just call that life. But as you get better and stronger at bringing the unconscious into the conscious realm, there's a synergy that occurs. And that synergy feeds into the growth of self. And so the first thing in life that we really need to focus our attention on from bringing out of the unconscious into the conscious is ourself. And the time and depth of that process varies from individual to individual. But that essentially becomes the first great task in life, is to become aware that there is a conscious and unconscious state. Just because a person is breathing and living and eating meals and go to a job doesn't mean they have become conscious of self. It just means that their unconscious routines are carrying them through a great portion of their lives. And giving birth to the inner self, which is the faculty required to start giving examination to the unconscious factors in our life to bring them into consciousness, is really where the know thyself motto begins. And when you get that first spark going internally, you go, oh, I do have an inner life, I do have a soul. And you go, oh, well, what's the first thing I should examine? I mean, it's easier to examine the external world. But really, when you're ready for it, you got to begin with self. It's every person's task to do that. Because once a person brings themselves, if we examine ourselves and go, oh, what am I? And that's the beginning question to bring the unconscious self into the conscious self. And when we do that, when we bring the unconscious self into the conscious self, then we can become who we wish to be. Then our hopes and dreams and desires can channel through us. Until that moment, when we're more unconscious than conscious, then really what's happening is not only we just a creature of habit and running unconscious routines for our life, but we're also subject to other people in the reality, either consciously or unconsciously. They're projecting on us to do what they want to do. And the more unconscious we are, the more open we are to other people motivating our actions because we're unconscious. And when you're unconscious, then it doesn't really matter much to you because it's just another activity. If you're not conscious of yourself and what you're doing and what you want out of life, then it doesn't really make a difference to you if you're doing something for other people. Now, when we look at life, that also ends up becoming a catalyzing process for a lot of people because people essentially reach their limits of their unconscious self being used or serving other intentions. And then at some point, an internal meter typically goes off, and people goes, "Hey, I don't like this. I don't like unconsciously serving other people's intentions." The most obvious case of that is slavery. People go, "Hey, I don't like being a slave." Oh, why don't they like being a slave? Where does the rubber meet the road on that? It's that the intentions of their inner self are not being served, and their life is being served in servitude to other people's intentions. And that's typically a function of being unconscious. Now, slavery and other forms of slavery and the various forms of it are particularly insidious because becoming conscious of self doesn't in and of itself end the servitude. And then that becomes a battle of wills, typically, is the human story on that. And it rears its head everywhere we are. But philosophically, and when we distill it down, it comes down to the degree of conscious awareness of the individual. How much unconscious activity is residing in you, and how much conscious activity is residing in you. And that is a metric that we all have direct control over. It's arguably the most important factor in our development, and we have 100% control over it. How conscious are we of self? How conscious are we of our inner life and the attendant values and mechanisms and processes in ourselves, which we have control over, to bring ourselves into conscious awareness, and thus to grow into consciousness and places beyond our imagination. So, what is conscious? What is unconscious? I think we got a pretty good coverage there. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you find it catalyzes your consciousness of self. I hope you become more conscious. I hope I become more conscious. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you have a good day.